The word China doesn't come from China. It comes from a dynasty that lasted 14 years. 14 years. Shorter than most wars, shorter than some people's gym memberships. A state that burned more books than it left standing. A state that executed the scholars who dared to criticize it. A state run by a philosophy that said flat out that human beings are fundamentally selfish and can only be controlled through fear and reward, and that this is not a problem to be solved, it's a feature to be used. And the man who built it? He started as a hostage child in an enemy city. He took the throne at 13. He conquered 6 kingdoms in 9 years. He burned the past. He tried to live forever. And he died at 49, alone on a dusty road, probably poisoned by the very pills he'd been swallowing in hopes of becoming immortal. His name was Ying Zheng, but history knows him as Qin Shi Huangdi, the first emperor. The man who didn't just conquer China, he invented it. And that's what nobody tells you. The China that exists today, its borders, its bureaucracy, its writing system, its very idea of itself as one unified civilization, all of it traces back to one man's obsession with control. A man who is equal parts visionary and tyrant, builder and destroyer, genius and paranoid maniac. A man whose tomb, buried under a hill in central China, has never been opened because it's reportedly full of rivers of flowing mercury, rigged crossbows primed to shoot trespassers, and replicas of the entire known world built in miniature underground. That tomb has been sitting there for over 2,000 years. And scientists think it might still be leaking. If you want to understand where modern China comes from, if you want to understand how a civilization holds itself together across centuries, dynasties, catastrophes, this is where you start. Right here, with this one extraordinary, terrible, brilliant man. If this is already pulling you in, hit subscribe. New videos drop every single day, and we are just getting warmed up. Drop a like if you want more stories like this one. Now, let's go back. Picture a map of Eastern Asia, but not the map you know. No neat borders, no single country called China. Instead, imagine the land carved up into 7 rival kingdoms, each with its own language, its own currency, its own army, its own king who has declared himself fully independent and fully willing to go to war to prove it. This is the world that produced Qin Shi Huangdi, and it was a world in flames. Historians call it the Warring States period. That name undersells it. Between roughly the mid-5th century BC and 221 BC, a stretch of time longer than the entire history of the United States, from its founding to right now, these 7 kingdoms fought each other without pause. 358 wars in roughly 2.5 centuries. Not skirmishes, wars. Armies of hundreds of thousands. Battles that wiped out entire generations of young men. The total death toll, by some estimates, was in the millions, in an era when the entire population of this region was a fraction of what it is today. The 7 kingdoms were Qi, Chu, Yan, Han, Zhao, Wei, and Qin. 7 power centers, 7 royal courts, 7 competing visions of who should rule all of this, and none of them could finish it. Every time one kingdom gained the upper hand, the others would form an alliance against it. The balance of power kept resetting, like a game that nobody could win and nobody could quit. It was out of this chaos, out of the absolute necessity of outsmarting, outfighting, and outmaneuvering everyone around you, that some of the greatest minds in human history emerged. Sun Tzu wrote The Art of War during this era. Confucius tried and failed to find a ruler who would listen to his ideas about benevolence and moral governance. The 100 schools of thought, Taoism, legalism, Mohism, Confucianism, all bloomed in this era because every kingdom was desperate for an idea that might give them an edge. And hovering over all of this, completely powerless, was the Zhou dynasty. The Zhou had once been the legitimate rulers of all of this land. Their dynasty stretched back nearly 8 centuries, one of the longest in Chinese history. But by the time of the Warring States period, the Zhou emperor was a ghost. He had a title, he had a palace, he had absolutely no authority over anything. The real kings had long since stopped pretending to be his vassals. He was a symbol without power, the way you might keep an old portrait on the wall long after the person in it is gone. This is the world a child was born into in the year 259 BC, in a city called Handan, in the kingdom of Zhao. His name was Ying Zheng, and almost everything about the circumstances of his birth was wrong. His father, a Qin prince named Yi Ren, was living in Handan as a hostage. That's the context you need to understand. In the Warring States period, it was standard diplomatic practice to send members of the royal family to live in rival kingdoms as insurance, a guarantee of good behavior. If your kingdom broke the peace, the rival killed your prince. Yi Ren was that prince. He was living in Handan, watched, controlled, dependent on the goodwill of people who were essentially his captors. And his situation was even worse than that. Back in Qin, Yuren wasn't even the favored son. His own father had dozens of sons by different mothers, and Yuren, whose mother had fallen out of favor, was low on the list of likely heirs. He was a prince sent to a foreign court as a hostage precisely because he was expendable. Into this comes a man named Lu Buwei, a merchant. Not nobility, a merchant, but a merchant of extraordinary intelligence and even more extraordinary ambition. Lu Buwei saw in the forgotten Prince Yuren something nobody else was seeing, an investment opportunity, a long-shot bet that could pay off spectacularly. He cultivated Yuren, introduced him to the right people, used his own wealth to bribe the right officials back in Qin, and, through what must have been a dazzlingly complicated sequence of political maneuvering, managed to get Yuren designated as the Crown Prince of Qin. The payoff? Lu Buwei became the most powerful man in the kingdom, second only to the king himself. But there's a detail in all of this that ancient historians found irresistible, and that historians have been arguing about ever since. According to some sources, including the great Han Dynasty historian Sima Qian, before Lu Buwei introduced his concubine, a woman named Zhao Ji, to Prince Yuren, she was already pregnant with Lu Buwei's child. And that child was Ying Zheng. If true, it means the first emperor of China was not actually of royal blood at all. He was the son of a merchant who had outmaneuvered the entire aristocracy. Most modern historians think this story was probably invented later. Political slander designed to delegitimize Qin Shi Huangdi after his dynasty collapsed. It has the convenient quality of being exactly what his enemies would want to be true. But the rumor was powerful enough that it followed him throughout his reign, and it tells you something about the suspicion and the whispers that surrounded this man from the very beginning. What we do know is this: Ying Zheng was born in Handan, in the enemy kingdom of Zhao, as the son of a hostage prince and a woman with a complicated past. He spent his early childhood in that city, probably aware at some level that he was surrounded by people who saw his family as a political pawn. When the situation in Qin changed and his father was finally recalled, the young Zheng made his way back to a kingdom he barely knew, to claim a future that was anything but guaranteed. He was 9 years old. Yi Ren didn't last long as king. He died just 3 years after ascending the throne, which meant that Ying Zheng became king of Qin at 13. Think about that for a second. 13 years old. King of one of the most powerful and aggressive states in the known world. A state that was already, by this point, the dominant military force in the region. A state built on a philosophy that had no patience for sentimentality, inefficiency, or weakness. And he was 13. For nearly a decade, the government was run by others, primarily Lu Buwei, who had engineered the whole situation and now expected to reap the rewards of his investment. Lu Buwei held the title of chancellor and wielded the real power. And then there was Zheng's mother, the Dowager Queen Zhao Ji, who had her own designs and her own alliances. The situation inside the Qin court was, to put it mildly, complicated. The young king was king in name only, and everyone around him knew it. But Yin Zheng was watching, learning, cataloging. The scandal that finally gave him his opening involved his own mother. The Dowager Queen had taken a lover, a man named Lao Ai, reportedly introduced into the court by Lu Buwei himself as a kind of distraction. Lao Ai was given an official title, land, servants, and then he got ambitious. He began building his own faction, his own private army, his own network of loyal supporters. When Zheng was away from the capital in the year 238 BC, Lao Ai made his move, attempting what amounted to a coup, using forged royal seals to mobilize troops. He failed. The rebellion was crushed. And then Yin Zheng, now 22 years old, showed everyone exactly what kind of king he intended to be. Lao Ai was executed, in the most gruesome way ancient China offered, which was public dismemberment. His entire clan was wiped out. The young king's mother was stripped of her political power and banished from the capital. And Lu Buwei, the man who had made all of this possible, who had shaped the very circumstances of Zheng's existence, was exiled. Lu Buwei killed himself 2 years later, likely understanding that a summons to return to court would have meant death. Yin Zheng did not weep. He did not hesitate. He did not issue pardons to display his magnanimity. He identified every person who had undermined his authority, and he removed them, completely, permanently, without sentiment. He was 22, and everyone who remained at court now understood something that would define the next 30 years. This young king was not someone you could manage. He was not someone you could manipulate. He was not someone who would be satisfied with power in name only. He intended to be the most powerful human being who had ever lived. But here's something the history books often skip over when they talk about Qin Shi Huangdi's conquest. The military genius, the iron will, the relentless ambition. None of it would have been enough on its own. What made Qin unstoppable wasn't just its army, it was its philosophy. While the other 6 kingdoms were still arguing about virtue, Qin had adopted an idea that most of its rivals found deeply uncomfortable, an idea called legalism. Now, legalism isn't what it sounds like. It's not just a system of laws, it's a complete political philosophy, and its starting point is a premise that Confucius would have found horrifying. Human beings are fundamentally self-interested. They don't do good because they're inherently good. They do good because they're rewarded for it and punished for doing otherwise. The moment you remove the reward and the punishment, people look out for themselves. Confucius believed that a ruler who governed with virtue and moral example would inspire the people to be virtuous themselves. The legalists looked at that idea and saw a fantasy, a dangerous fantasy. Because while you're busy being virtuous, the kingdom next door is raising an army. The man who put legalism to work in Qin was a reformer named Shang Yang, and he did it decades before Yin Zheng was even born. Shang Yang reorganized Qin society from top to bottom. He abolished the hereditary aristocracy. No more power by birthright. Position and privilege had to be earned, specifically through military service. Kill enemies in battle, get promoted. Capture prisoners, get rewarded. Farm effectively, get tax relief. Fail to do your duty? Any duty. Face consequences. There were no exceptions for bloodline, for family, for old connections. This sounds abstract. In practice, it meant that Qin's army was populated by men who had everything to gain by fighting as hard as they possibly could. An ordinary farmer could rise to be a commander through battlefield achievement. A soldier who took the head of an enemy officer got a measurable, concrete reward. Land, a title, goods. The incentive structure was brutal and perfectly calibrated. And then there was Li Si. Li Si was the man Yin Zheng found, or who found Yin Zheng, and made his grand counselor. A legalist scholar of extraordinary brilliance, Li Si became the architect of everything that followed. He was cold, systematic, and utterly devoted to the idea that the state was the supreme value, and everything else, tradition, sentiment, rival schools of thought, was an obstacle to be cleared away. Together, Ying Zheng and Li Si made for a combination that the ancient world had never quite seen before. A king of absolute will and infinite patience, and an advisor of matchless administrative genius. Between them, they took an already formidable state and transformed it into something new. Not just a kingdom, but a machine. A machine for conquest, for control, for permanence. And in 230 BC, they turned that machine on the world. Han fell first. It made sense. Han was the smallest and most exhausted of the seven kingdoms, located right on Qin's eastern border, weakened by years of raids and pressure. When Qin's general Wang Jian arrived with his forces, the king of Han made a calculation that was logical, if humiliating. He surrendered, sent diplomats, handed over his kingdom's administration, and saved his people from whatever came next. Han was absorbed in 230 BC. Then came Wei. Wei was a different problem. Its capital, a city called Daliang, was protected by walls that Qin's armies found impossible to breach by direct assault. The city was enormous, the fortifications were solid, and the defenders knew how to hold a position. A direct attack wasn't going to work. So Qin's generals did something that sounds almost absurd when you first hear it. They diverted a river. There was a waterway near Daliang connected to the Yellow River, and Qin's engineers, and Qin had exceptional engineers, because Qin invested in infrastructure the way other kingdoms invested in ceremony, redirected its flow toward the city walls. The water rose. The walls began to fail. Daliang, one of the great cities of the ancient world, was inundated. Not breached, drowned. Wei fell in 225 BC. Zhao proved harder. Zhao had generals, genuine ones, men who knew how to fight Qin and had done it before. Most dangerous among them was Li Mu, arguably the greatest military commander of the era. He had spent years holding Qin forces at bay on the northern frontier, and when he was transferred south to face Wang Jian's invasion, he managed to hold the line. Qin couldn't break through, so they did something else instead. Something that requires no army at all. Qin sent agents into the Zhao court with gold and whispers. They spread the rumor that Li Mu was planning a betrayal, that he intended to make a deal with Qin, hand over the kingdom, cut a deal for himself. The king of Zhao, paranoid and poorly advised, believed it. He had Li Mu arrested, executed. His greatest general, the one man who might have stopped what was coming, eliminated by his own king on the basis of a lie planted by the enemy. Zhao collapsed shortly after. It was 228 BC. Yan tried an assassination. The story of Jing Ke is one of the most famous in all of Chinese history. Yan's crown prince, desperate, hired a man named Jing Ke, a swordsman, a strategist, a man who knew he was going on a mission he would not survive, to walk into Ying Zheng's throne room and kill him. The cover story, Jing Ke was a diplomatic envoy bringing a gift, a map of Yan territory that Qin was demanding. The real gift was hidden inside the map, a poisoned dagger. The moment came. Jing Ke unrolled the map before the king. The dagger was there. He lunged. He missed. Ying Zheng ran from his own throne, trying to draw his sword, but the ceremonial sword was too long for its scabbard, and in his panic, he couldn't get it free. His ministers, forbidden by law from carrying weapons in the throne room, could only watch. Finally, someone shouted at him to sling the scabbard behind his back to draw it. He did, and he drew the sword and cut down Jing Ke where he stood. They say the king trembled afterward. They say it took a long time for the shaking to stop. Jing Ke died, and Yan fell. But the assassination attempt never left Ying Zheng. He had looked death in the eye, and it had changed something in him. The obsession that would define his later years, the desperate, consuming need to live forever, began in that throne room, in that moment when the dagger missed by inches. Chu fought the longest war. Chu was vast, the largest of the kingdoms by territory, stretching across an enormous swath of central and southern China. It took all of Wang Jian's skill and a campaign of several years, But Chu fell in 223 BC. And Qi? Qi surrendered without fighting at all. Qin had spent years carefully, methodically cultivating Qi's chancellor, bribing him, keeping him convinced that Qin had no designs on Qi, that the two kingdoms could coexist. By the time Qi's king realized this was a lie, he was surrounded. His armies mobilized to the western border, but when Qin's forces came, they came from the north, from the former Yan territories, not from the direction anyone expected. The Qi army was in the wrong place. The capital was open. The king surrendered. It was 221 BC. The last of the 6 kingdoms was gone. 9 years, 6 kingdoms, millions of square miles, hundreds of millions of people, and Ying Zhang stood at the center of it all, 38 years old, master of more territory than any man alive had ever controlled, looking for a word big enough to describe what he had become. He couldn't find one, so he invented it. King wasn't going to work. Every one of the rulers he'd just conquered had been a king. That title carried the stench of defeat now. It was a word for the people he'd beaten. The title the Zhou emperors had used? That carried its own baggage. The baggage of a dynasty that had watched its own authority dissolve for centuries until it was nothing but a name.
So Ying Zhang, who had spent his entire reign doing things no one had ever done, thinking in categories that didn't exist before he created them, invented a new title. He went to the ancient myths, to the stories of China's legendary past, and he pulled 2 words out of them. Huang, meaning something like August or radiant, associated with the 3 mythical sovereigns of prehistoric legend, and Di, meaning divine ruler or emperor, associated with the 5 sage emperors who followed. He combined them into Huangdi, and he put Shi, meaning first, in front of it. Qin Shi Huangdi, the first August divine emperor of Qin. He announced that his successors would be the 2nd emperor, the 3rd emperor, and so on, for 10,000 generations. His dynasty, he declared, would be eternal. But the title was more than ego. It was theology. It was a claim about the nature of the cosmos, because behind it lay one of the most powerful ideas in Chinese civilization, an idea that historians of East Asian monarchy have called the mandate of heaven. And to understand what Qin Shi Huang was claiming when he took that title, you have to understand what this idea meant. The mandate of heaven, Tianming in Chinese, was the philosophical foundation that legitimized every emperor who followed. And it worked like this. Heaven, not a personal god, not a bearded figure on a throne, but something more abstract, more impersonal, a kind of cosmic moral order. Heaven periodically chose a family to rule, a family that demonstrated virtue, competence, the qualities required for leadership. Heaven handed them a mandate, the right and the duty to govern.
And here's where it gets interesting. That mandate was not permanent. It could be revoked. When a dynasty began to fail, when its rulers became corrupt, when floods and famines multiplied, when rebellions broke out, when the order of things fell apart, heaven was sending a signal. The mandate was being withdrawn. And the proof of this was the chaos itself. The suffering itself was evidence that heaven had turned its face away. And when a new leader emerged from the chaos, a general, a rebel, sometimes even a peasant, and managed to restore order, that was the proof that heaven had chosen a new family. The new dynasty's legitimacy came from its success. If you won, heaven had chosen you. If heaven had chosen you, you won. It's a circular logic, but a remarkably elegant one. It means the existing order is always legitimate until it isn't. It means revolution is always available as a theological concept, justified by heaven itself. And it means every dynasty carries within it the seed of its own potential fall, which is the surest incentive imaginable for a ruler to govern well. The Zhou dynasty's mandate had clearly expired. 250 years of chaos was all the evidence anyone needed. And Ying Zheng's conquest, 9 years, 6 kingdoms, absolute victory, was the most dramatic possible demonstration that heaven had chosen someone new. The mandate had passed. The new holder was standing right there, surrounded by the ruins of everything that had come before. He ordered a jade seal carved from a legendary gemstone, a stone that had been fought over by kingdoms for generations, and inscribed it with 8 characters. Having received the mandate from heaven, may the emperor's reign be long and prosperous. This was the heirloom seal of the realm, physical proof. Heaven's stamp of approval in stone, passed from emperor to emperor for over 1,000 years until it was lost. He was not just a conqueror. He was the cosmos choosing a new vessel. And if you believed in the mandate of heaven, and everyone did, there was nothing left to say. The argument was over. Now came the harder work. Conquering 6 kingdoms is, in a certain sense, the easy part. War has rules, or something like rules. You move armies, you break walls, you take cities. Brutal, yes. Costly, yes. But comprehensible. You know when you've won. Governing what you've won? That's where empires actually succeed or fail. And what Qin Shi Huangdi attempted next was something that had never been tried before on this scale. A total reconstruction of the social and administrative fabric of an entire civilization. Think about what he was looking at. 7 kingdoms that had existed independently for centuries, each with its own writing system, its own currency, its own systems of weights and measures, its own legal traditions, its own local aristocracies with deeply entrenched interests, its own dialects, its own sense of identity. These weren't just political rivals. They were genuinely different cultures that happened to be geographically adjacent. And Ying Zheng looked at all of this and said, "We're going to make it one thing." Start with the writing. In the former warring states, different regions wrote the same words differently. The character for horse looked one way in Qi, another in Chu, another in Zhao. A document from one region might be incomprehensible to a reader from another. Qin Shi Huangdi ordered the development of a unified script, what became known as small seal script, and mandated its use across the entire empire. Every official document, every inscription, every public record. One system, everywhere. The cultural weight of this cannot be overstated. China is a land of extraordinary linguistic diversity. Even today, the dialects spoken in different regions are often mutually unintelligible when spoken aloud. But because the writing system represents ideas rather than sounds, a unified script meant that someone who spoke a completely different language could still read what you wrote. The written language became the connective tissue of a civilization that would have otherwise fractured along 1,000 fault lines. It still works that way today. Then came currency. 7 kingdoms, 7 different coin systems. Qin Shi Huangdi standardized them. One currency, one weight, one value. This isn't just an economic convenience, though it was certainly that. It's a statement about who controls the definition of value. When the money comes from the emperor is in every transaction. He standardized weights and measures, the units used to weigh grain, to measure cloth, to calculate taxes. He standardized the width of wagon axles. This last one seems almost comically specific, until you think about it. If every cart is built to the same axle width, then the ruts those carts carve into roads are the same width everywhere. A cart from the western frontier fits the roads in the eastern coastal regions. The empire becomes physically traversable in a way it wasn't before. Infrastructure as ideology. He built roads. 8 great highways radiating outward from the capital city of Xianyang. Roads wide enough for multiple carriages. Roads that the state maintained and that imperial inspectors traveled to ensure they were kept up. The Roman roads of Europe are justly famous. They helped hold an empire together. Qin's road system did the same thing, in the same era, on the other side of the world. And then he did something that might have been the most radical reform of all. He abolished the feudal system. Completely. The feudal system, the distribution of land and power to hereditary noble families who governed their territories in exchange for loyalty to the king, had been the basic structure of Chinese civilization for centuries. It was how the Zhou had ruled. It was how everyone had ruled. And it had a fatal flaw. It created layers of power between the emperor and the people, and those layers had a tendency to become self-interested, to become independent, to become exactly the kind of fragmentation that the Warring States period represented. Qin Shi Huangdi replaced it with something entirely new, a bureaucratic state divided into 36 commanderies, each governed by 3 officials, a civil administrator, a military commander, and an imperial inspector, all appointed by the emperor, all answerable directly to him, all serving at his pleasure rather than by hereditary right. No noble bloodlines, no inherited power. The state belonged to the state, not to the families who served it. This was revolutionary. It was also, in practice, a terrifying amount of centralized control for one human being to hold. But that was the point. That had always been the point. While the bureaucrats were standardizing axle widths and coin shapes, Qin Shi Huangdi was also building things on a scale that the ancient world had never seen. The Great Wall is the one everyone knows. But the wall as we picture it today, the imposing stone structure that snakes across mountain ridges in the photographs, is mostly a product of the Ming Dynasty, built over 1,000 years after Qin Shi Huangdi. What he built was something different, a network of earthen walls connecting and extending fortifications that the individual kingdoms had already begun constructing along their northern borders, creating for the first time a single defensive line against the Xiongnu, the nomadic steppe peoples who posed a constant military threat from the north. General Meng Qian commanded this project with somewhere between 300,000 and 500,000 men, soldiers, conscripted laborers, convicts, prisoners of war. They worked in terrain that was punishing: mountains, desert, extremes of heat and cold. The death toll was catastrophic. Legends say the wall is built on the bones of the workers who died building it. That's not quite literally true. There aren't bones inside the wall, but as a metaphor for the human cost, it's not far off. The wall consumed lives by the tens of thousands. The families of those workers received no acknowledgement, no compensation, nothing but the occasional message that their son or father or husband would not be coming home. And while that was happening, there was the tomb. Construction on Qin Shi Huangdi's burial complex had begun the year he became king of Qin, when he was 13 years old. It continued for 38 years, employing at its peak close to 700,000 workers drawn from across the empire. The complex was not a tomb in the ordinary sense. It was an entire underground kingdom, built for a man who intended to rule even in death with the same absolute authority he had exercised in life. The centerpiece, the burial chamber itself, which has never been opened, was reportedly constructed with a ceiling painted with stars and constellations, and a floor where rivers of mercury flowed along channels shaped to represent the Yellow River and the Yangtze, all mechanically driven so they actually moved. The rivers of China, miniaturized and made eternal, surrounding the body of the man who had made them his. Protecting it, an army of terracotta warriors, over 8,000 of them, life-sized, each face individually sculpted so that no two are identical. Generals, archers, infantry, cavalry, charioteers. They stood guard in formation in the pits surrounding the tomb, an army that would accompany the emperor into whatever came next. They were discovered in 1974 by farmers digging a well during a drought. The farmers had a clay head a few feet down. They thought it was just old pottery. When archaeologists arrived, they found something that had been waiting underground for over 2,000 years. The tomb complex itself, that underground palace with its mercury rivers, has still never been excavated.
Scientists inserted sensors into the soil and found mercury levels 100 times higher than background levels, in a distribution that corresponds exactly to the geography of China's major rivers. The ancient historian Sima Qian wasn't making it up. The tomb is sealed. It will likely stay sealed for decades more. The technology to excavate it without destroying what's inside doesn't exist yet. He built palaces too. One of them, the Yipang Palace, was described by later historians as so vast that its front hall alone could seat 10,000 people. That's not a typo. 10,000. A room the size of a small city. Archaeological work has not confirmed the full extent of these descriptions. The palace may be partly legendary, but the foundations that have been found are enormous. The ambition is not in question. All of this, the roads, the walls, the tomb, the palaces, required labor on a scale that the Qin state extracted from its people with merciless efficiency. The legalist system didn't stop to consider whether this was too much to ask. The state needed it. The people would provide it. Anyone who failed to comply would face consequences specified in the law code, which was detailed, comprehensive, and severe.
Qin Shi Huang's subjects were building an empire, whether they wanted to or not. 8 years into his reign as emperor, Qin Shi Huang held a great assembly of scholars in his capital. The stated purpose was debate. What should the future of the empire look like? How should it be governed? The scholars who gathered were some of the finest minds in the new unified China, men who had spent their lives studying history, philosophy, governance. They knew the Zhou dynasty. They knew the warring states. They knew the tradition. And that was precisely the problem. One scholar, a man named Chunyu Yue, stood up and made an argument. He said, "Look at history. The Zhou dynasty governed through a feudal system, distributing power to loyal noble families. This worked for centuries. The Qin system, centralized, bureaucratic, with no hereditary nobility, was untested, dangerous. What happens, he asked, when the emperor dies and there is no established network of loyal princes and lords to maintain order? The empire will fall apart." It was a reasonable argument. It was also, from Li Si's perspective, an act of treason. Li Si stood up and made a counter-argument that is one of the most chilling documents in the history of political thought. The scholars, he said, use their knowledge of the past to criticize the present. This is not scholarship. This is sedition. The old books, the old histories, the old philosophical texts that these men quote to undermine imperial authority, they are weapons, and weapons should be controlled. His proposal? Burn them. Not all books. Qin's own historical records would be preserved, along with books on agriculture, medicine, and divination. But the books of history, poetry, and philosophy that the scholars used to invoke the authority of the past against the authority of the present? Gone. All of them. Private citizens would have 30 days to surrender their copies. After that, possession of a prohibited book was a capital offense. Qin Shi Huang approved it. The fires burned in 213 BC. Libraries that had accumulated over centuries. Texts, commentaries, records, poetry, the entire philosophical explosion of the 100 schools of thought, reduced to ash. Not entirely, because some books survived hidden in walls, in memory, smuggled across borders. But the institutional knowledge of the old world was deliberately, systematically attacked in a way that no act of warfare had ever managed. And then, the following year, came the scholars themselves. The version that most ancient sources preserve goes like this. Qin Shi Huang had been increasingly investing in the quest for immortality, sending expeditions, summoning alchemists, distributing funding to anyone who claimed to know the secret of eternal life. 2 of these alchemists, having taken imperial money and failed to produce results, realized that the emperor's patience had limits and quietly fled. When Qin Shi Huang found out, he was furious. An investigation followed. Scholars who had criticized the regime were implicated, whether fairly or not. In the end,
460 scholars were executed. Some sources say they were buried alive. The exact number, the exact method, these are disputed.
The Han historians who recorded this were writing after Qin's collapse, with every reason to portray the first emperor in the worst possible light. But the core of the story, that scholars were executed for criticizing the regime in connection with the book burning, is almost certainly true. Legalism made it logical. The state was the supreme value. Dissent was not a political disagreement. It was a threat to the cosmic order that the emperor embodied. Remove the dissent, remove the record. Remove everything that gave the past authority over the present. Qin Shi Huangdi intended to start the world over, from himself. But the emperor had one enemy he couldn't execute. He couldn't bribe it. He couldn't outmaneuver it. He couldn't flood its capital or have his agents plant rumors in its court. He couldn't standardize it out of existence or burn the books that described it. Death. And Qin Shi Huangdi, the man who had conquered everything, who had remade an entire civilization in his image, who had stood in his throne room while a dagger missed his face by inches and walked away, had decided, with the same absolute iron certainty he brought to everything else, that death was simply another problem waiting for the right solution. He just needed to find it first. The obsession didn't come from nowhere. After the assassination attempt in the throne room, the dagger, the chaos, the trembling aftermath, something shifted in Qin Shi Huangdi that never fully reset. Before Jing Ke's blade, he had been a man focused entirely outward, on conquest, on rivals, on the world. After it, a new preoccupation began quietly colonizing his attention. He had been so close. The margin between becoming the ruler of all of China and dying on his own throne had been measured in inches, in the angle of a thrown weapon, in the fraction of a second it took to dodge. He survived, he conquered, he built the empire. And then he lay awake, thinking about all the ways it could still be taken from him. He survived 3 assassination attempts over the course of his reign. 3 separate plots by men willing to die to stop him. The first came before unification. The second was Jing Ke. A third involved a musician hired to approach the emperor with a specially weighted lute concealed as a weapon. Each time, Qin Shi Huangdi walked away. Each time, the near miss left its mark. He began to vary his sleeping quarters nightly. No one, not even his closest advisors, was permitted to know where he would sleep on any given night. A network of covered walkways connected the buildings of his palace complex so he could move without being seen. He spent less and less time in public, becoming increasingly invisible even to his own court. The man who had reshaped China was vanishing inside his own palace, terrified of the world he ruled. And the fear of assassination shaded, gradually, into something larger, the fear of time itself, of the body's inevitable dissolution, of the fact that no matter how many kingdoms you conquer, death takes them all back. In the philosophies of ancient China, immortality was not a ridiculous idea. It was a serious one, with serious practitioners and a serious literature. Taoist tradition held that certain individuals, through the right practices, the right substances, the right spiritual cultivation, could transcend ordinary human limitation. Immortals were said to dwell on sacred mountains or on mythical islands in the Eastern Sea, untouchable, eternal, beyond the reach of time. They were real, as far as most people were concerned, in the same way that heaven and earth were real. Qin Shi Huangdi believed, or chose to believe, or needed to believe. The distinction probably didn't matter to him. He began summoning experts, alchemists, mystics, shamans, anyone who claimed knowledge of the path to eternal life. He funded expeditions. He listened to proposals. He read what ancient texts remained about the secrets of longevity. His court filled with people selling immortality the way others might sell horses or silk, and the emperor, the most powerful buyer in the known world, was in the market. Li So watched this development with the careful silence of a man who understood that expressing skepticism about the emperor's immortality project would be extremely unwise. The most dramatic of these quests was the mission of Xu Fu. Xu Fu was a court scholar, an expert in the occult arts, and a man of considerable nerve. He approached the emperor with a story. There were mythical islands in the Eastern Sea, islands where immortal beings dwelled, where the herbs and minerals of eternal life grew in abundance. The islands were called Pan Lai, Fang Jiang, and Yingzhou. They were real. He had evidence. Qin Shi Huangdi, who had sent armies across 6 kingdoms, who had diverted rivers and drafted hundreds of thousands of men for his wall, authorized Xu Fu to sail east with a fleet of ships, thousands of young men and women selected for their physical perfection, and whatever supplies he needed. The mission? Find the islands. Bring back the elixir of immortality. Xu Fu sailed east, and he never came back. Whether he found something, built something, settled somewhere, or simply decided that returning empty-handed to an emperor famous for executing people who disappointed him was a poor life choice, no one knows. The expedition disappeared into the Pacific. A legend has persisted for 2,000 years that Xu Fu eventually reached Japan, and that his people are among the ancestors of the Japanese population. There is no proof of this, but the story keeps circulating, which tells you something about how the mind fills in the blanks when the evidence runs out. Qin Shi Huangdi waited. Then he sent another expedition. That one didn't come back either. He kept looking. He traveled to sacred mountains to perform rituals and ask heaven for guidance. He climbed to the summit of Mount Tai, perhaps the most spiritually significant mountain in Chinese tradition, the seat of powers that governed the universe, and performed the grand sacrificial rites called Feng and Shan, ceremonies that only the most legitimate of emperors, those confirmed by heaven, were permitted to perform. He stood at the summit, surrounded by wind and clouds, and announced his achievements to the cosmos. He was not an irrational man. He had spent decades doing very rational things with extraordinary effectiveness. But rationality and irrationality don't occupy separate rooms in a person's mind. They share the same space, and when the stakes are high enough and the need is desperate enough, the walls between them get thin. The alchemists at court had a theory. It wasn't unreasonable by the standards of ancient pharmacology. Certain minerals, properly prepared and consumed in the right quantities, could purify the body, drive out disease, and ultimately confer something approaching immortality. The most powerful of these substances was mercury, liquid metal, silver and shimmering, unlike anything else in the natural world, behaving in ways that seemed almost magical to a pre-scientific observer. It didn't rot. It didn't rust. It stayed pure. Maybe, the alchemists suggested, its purity could transfer to the body. The emperor began consuming mercury. Not once, not occasionally, regularly. Doses mixed into pills by his court physicians, who presumably believed in what they were doing, or who knew better than to tell the most powerful man alive that his immortality project was built on a poison. Mercury attacks the nervous system. Slowly, insidiously, it accumulates in the body over time. The symptoms of chronic mercury poisoning include tremors, loss of coordination, dramatic shifts in mood and behavior, paranoia, impaired judgment, increasing irrationality. They are not subtle symptoms, but they are easy to explain away in a man who is already powerful, and already paranoid, and already prone to explosive anger. The poison hid inside the pathology. The man who was trying to live forever was being killed by the cure. In his final years, Qin Shi Huangdi began calling himself something new. He had started his reign addressing himself in the royal first person, the pronoun that marked absolute imperial authority. Then he adopted a different self-designation, Zhen Ren, a Taoist term, a word that meant something like __, quote _, 8 __. The title used for an individual who had transcended ordinary human limitation. who had moved beyond the realm of the merely mortal. He was no longer describing himself as emperor. He was describing himself as something beyond emperorship. His behavior grew increasingly erratic. He ordered that no one was permitted to speak of his death in his presence. He flew into rages at advisors who brought him unwelcome news. He issued orders that seemed designed to banish the concept of mortality from his vicinity by force of imperial will. He had fish in the rivers near his palaces protected by law, so that the sight of fish dying would not remind him that things died. He traveled obsessively. Imperial inspection tours of the empire, massive processions with thousands of attendants moving from province to province, demonstrating the emperor's presence and authority everywhere. These tours were also, on some level, another manifestation of the immortality quest. Movement, restlessness, the refusal to be still in one place long enough for death to find him. On his fifth inspection tour, in the summer of 210 BC, somewhere in what is now Hebei province, Qin Shi Huangdi died. He was 49 years old. The precise cause remains uncertain. The mercury poisoning had almost certainly been doing its slow, invisible work for years. There is also evidence suggesting he suffered seizures, possibly a result of the poisoning, possibly a separate neurological condition. What we know is that he had been weakening, that the tours had grown more punishing as his body declined, and that somewhere, on a dusty road far from his capital, the most powerful man in the ancient world simply stopped. He was 49. He had ruled Qin since he was 13. He had been emperor for 11 years. He had remade an entire civilization, and he died without finding what he was looking for. The irony is almost unbearable. The thing that probably killed him was the treatment he was taking to avoid being killed. He was poisoned to death by his own immortality pills. And then the cover-up began. The man who orchestrated it was Li Si, the Grand Counselor, the architect of the legalist empire, the man who had been at Qin Shi Huangdi's side for decades. Li Si understood, with the cold clarity that had always been his hallmark, exactly what the emperor's death meant. The heir apparent was a man named Fusu, the eldest son, a serious and capable prince who had clashed with his father over the book burnings and the executions of scholars, and had been sent to the northern frontier as a consequence, serving under General Meng Tian. Fusu was competent. Fusu had integrity. Fusu would almost certainly clean house when he took the throne, which meant that Li Si, author of the book burnings, executor of the scholars, the man most responsible for the empire's most brutal policies, would be among the first to go. So Li Si made a choice. The imperial entourage was 2 months' journey from the capital, 2 months of summer heat, 2 months of roads and dust, and the slow progress of a great procession across the empire. Li Si ordered the emperor's death concealed. The only people told were Li Si himself, a younger son named Hu Hai, and a palace official named Zhao Gao, a eunuch, or someone described as one, though the historical evidence is a little ambiguous, who had been Hu Hai's tutor and who had his own reasons for wanting someone more malleable than Fusu on the throne. The three of them, together, decided to keep the emperor alive, on paper. The imperial wagon continued. The daily routines continued. Food was brought to the wagon and removed. Messages from the emperor were issued, written by Li Si, forged in the emperor's name. The procession moved through towns and villages, performing the rituals of an imperial tour, and everyone they passed believed the emperor was inside his wagon, resting, conducting affairs of state. But Qin Shi Huangdi's body, in the summer heat, was decomposing. Li Si's solution to this problem was practical and revolting in equal measure. He ordered carts of salted fish, a common cargo in that region, strongly pungent, to be attached to the front and rear of the imperial procession. The smell of the fish, overwhelming and pervasive, masked whatever smell was coming from the emperor's wagon. The guards, the servants, the local officials who greeted the procession at every stop, none of them noticed. Or if they noticed, none of them dared say so. 2 months, thousands of miles, an empire holding its breath, not knowing it should. When the procession finally reached the capital, Li Se revealed the emperor's death. Simultaneously, he produced a document, a letter, allegedly written by Qin Shi Huangdi before he died, commanding the heir apparent Fu Su to commit suicide. It accused Fu Su of failures in his military duties. It named Hu Hai as the new emperor instead. The letter was a forgery. Li Se and Zhao Gao had written it themselves. Fu Su, who was a genuinely good man, read the letter from his father commanding his own death. He wept. He obeyed. He killed himself. General Meng Tian, who suspected something was wrong, who urged Fu Su to seek clarification before acting on the letter, was imprisoned, later executed. And Hu Hai, the second son, the one Li Se and Zhao Gao had chosen because he seemed like someone they could manage, became the second emperor of the Qin dynasty. What happened next is one of the most spectacular implosions in the history of great powers. The second emperor, Hu Hai, turned out to be not so much manageable as catastrophically incompetent. He governed through Zhao Gao, who had realized that controlling the emperor meant controlling the empire. Zhao Gao began eliminating anyone who might challenge his position: ministers, generals, members of the royal family. The Qin court, already a dangerous place, became a hall of knives. Officials learned to say whatever Zhao Gao wanted to hear, or not to say anything at all. The story that crystallized this moment in Chinese historical memory goes like this. Zhao Gao once presented a deer to the emperor and called it a horse. The emperor said it was a deer. Zhao Gao then asked each of the ministers present whether it was a horse or a deer. Those who said horse survived. Those who said deer, those who insisted on the evidence of their own eyes over the word of the most powerful man in the room, were later charged with crimes and executed. It was a test. Zhao Gao was finding out who he could trust to lie with him. The phrase, quote 9, entered the Chinese language. It's still there today. It means describing something as the opposite of what it plainly is, using power to override reality. The story is almost certainly embellished, but the phenomenon it describes was real, and it was destroying the Qin court from within. While the court destroyed itself, the empire burned. The grievances that the Qin system had been suppressing, the brutality of the labor drafts, the severity of the legal code, the crushing tax burden that funded all those walls and roads and palaces, the resentment of the abolished aristocracies, the pain of families who had lost sons and fathers to the wall, and the wars and the work gangs, all of it had been held down by the overwhelming force of the Qin state. Remove the force, and the pressure was extraordinary. In 209 BC, a year after Qin Shi Huangdi's death, a man named Chen Sheng was leading a group of conscript laborers to a frontier posting. They were delayed by flooding. Late, and under the Qin legal code, being late to your military posting was a capital offense. Chen Sheng did the math. Death if they arrived late. So why not take a shot at something bigger? He led a rebellion. It started small. It spread. It was the first major peasant uprising in Chinese history, and it proved something the legalists had never wanted to admit, that the people are not merely a resource to be extracted from. When you push them far enough, they push back. Chen Sheng's rebellion was eventually crushed, but it had cracked the dam. Other rebels followed. Former nobles from the conquered kingdoms, who had been waiting for exactly this moment, raised their own armies under the banner of restoring their ancestral states. A former Chu general named Xiang Yu emerged as one of the most formidable military commanders of the era. A peasant from a minor official family named Liu Bang began gathering forces in the chaos. Zhao Gao, watching all of this from his position inside the collapsing court, made one final move. He had Hu Hai murdered, the emperor he had made, the puppet he had spent years managing. In his place, he tried to install another puppet, The new puppet refused to cooperate. Zhao Gao was himself assassinated. The empire's third emperor lasted 46 days before he surrendered to Liu Bang's advancing forces. In 206 BC, just 4 years after the death of Qin Shi Huangdi, the dynasty collapsed. 4 years. 10,000 generations had lasted 4. The mandate of heaven, it turned out, worked exactly as advertised. Think about what that theory had predicted. A dynasty that governs well holds heaven's mandate. When a dynasty becomes corrupt, tyrannical, indifferent to the people's welfare, heaven signals its displeasure through floods and famines and rebellions. The suffering of the people is itself evidence that the mandate is being withdrawn. And when a new leader emerges from the chaos and restores order, when a new family proves itself capable of governing, that proof of capability is the proof of heaven's new choice. The Qin dynasty had been visionary, transformative, and brutal in equal measure. It had remade a civilization. It had also extracted from that civilization a price in blood and labor and suffering that the people were not willing to pay indefinitely. And when the force that made them pay it, the emperor's absolute will, backed by the legalist machinery of the state, suddenly disappeared, the backlash was instant and total. Heaven had withdrawn the mandate. Liu Bang emerged from the civil wars that followed Qin's collapse as the winner. He founded the Han dynasty in 202 BC. And here is where the story becomes genuinely astonishing. Liu Bang, the new emperor, looked at what Qin Shi Huangdi had built and made a crucial decision. He kept most of it. The administrative structure, the commanderies, the appointed officials, the meritocratic bureaucracy, the unified script, the roads, the standardized measures, he kept all of it. He softened the legal code. He reduced the labor demands. He allowed people to own their land again. He grafted Confucian philosophy onto the legalist skeleton, using Confucian ideas about moral governance, about the emperor's duty to the people, about virtue and education, to humanize a system that had nearly destroyed itself through sheer brutality. The result was one of the greatest dynasties in Chinese history, lasting over 400 years. And virtually everything about how it governed China came directly from the man it had replaced. The tyrant's machinery, operated by kinder hands, built an empire that lasted. Here is what Qin Shi Huangdi left behind. The word, quote, 10. The English word for that country, and the words for it in dozens of other languages, comes from, quote, 11, the dynasty he built. Every time someone says the word, quote, 12, they are, without knowing it, saying his name. A writing system. The unified script he mandated has evolved over 2,000 years, but the principle, one set of written characters for an entire civilization, allowing people who speak mutually incomprehensible dialects to communicate through shared symbols, is his. Modern Chinese characters are his descendants. An administrative template. Every dynasty that ruled China for the next 2,000 years, Han, Tang, Song, Ming, Qing, governed through a version of the bureaucratic system he invented. Appointed officials, meritocratic examination, central authority over regional administration. The form changed, the structure persisted. The concept of China itself. Before Qin Shi Huangdi, there was no China. There were kingdoms that shared a region, a general cultural tradition, a set of philosophical debates. He turned them into one thing. He didn't just conquer a territory, he created an identity. The idea that all of this belongs together, that these hundreds of millions of people across this vast geography are one civilization. That idea has its origin point in him. And underneath a hill in the Lintong district of Xi'an, a sealed chamber has been waiting for over 2,000 years. It has never been opened. It will likely stay that way for decades more, maybe longer. Whatever is inside, it belongs to him still. He wanted to live forever. He didn't, quite, but he built something that did. There is a kind of immortality that doesn't come from mercury pill. There is a kind of immortality that doesn't come from mercury pills, or mythical islands, or expeditions into the Eastern Sea. It comes from making something so fundamental, so woven into the fabric of a civilization, that the civilization can't be understood without it. Qin Shi Huangdi burned the past, but he became the past. For every generation that came after him, he wanted to be the first emperor for 10,000 generations. The 10,000 generations are still counting. 2,000 years of dynasties, each one legitimized by the mandate of heaven, each one inheriting the administrative skeleton he built, each one governing a civilization that defined itself against and through the template he created. All of it flows from one man, 13 years old on a throne, in a city he barely knew, in a kingdom that the other 6 had dismissed as a barbarous backwater. A boy born in an enemy city, raised on whispers and suspicion, took a throne at 13 and spent the next 4 decades remaking the world. He eliminated kingdoms, rewrote the rules of governance, burned the memory of everything that came before, searched desperately for something no human being has ever found, and died on a road, in the summer heat, attended by people who were already lying about his death before his body was cold. And he left behind a country of 1.5 billion people that still, in ways more direct than most of them know, carries his fingerprints. The first emperor, the man who made China. He's still in there, under the hill, surrounded by his rivers of mercury and his army of stone soldiers, waiting for someone with the technology and the nerve to finally open the door. Maybe that day is coming. Maybe, when it does, we'll finally know what he really looked like, what he really built, what he really thought about, in the long dark beneath the hill, surrounded by the miniature rivers of the country he invented. Or maybe, crossbows are still loaded.
And maybe that's exactly how he would have wanted it.